So before we get started, I just want to say a few things. This guide's for anyone looking to improve their Venom gameplay first and foremost. I've been maining Venom since beta, and in all my time spent playing him I've learned some boss ass tactics for the character. If you're looking for some casual fun on Venom, that's perfectly fine, and this guide can still be helpful. But for anyone interested in Venom's meta, stay tuned. Starting off, I wanted to mention Venom's passive, Alien Biology. It's a wall-coming passive that allows Venom to stick to walls and ceilings. This passive complements Venom's other abilities really well, but there isn't much to it, so let's just move on. Moving on, we have Venom's primary fire, Dark Predation. When used, a bunch of tendrils come shooting out from behind Venom. Again, there's not much to it, so I won't waste your time over explaining it. I'll just end off with some small note. You don't have to reload Dark Predation because it doesn't consume ammo, so you can just hold it down all day. Just aim for the head, and you'll KO enemies in no time. Next up, we have Venom's Swing. It's just a grappling hook, so for this ability I'll cut the shit and get straight to some advice. For anyone looking to improve their Venom gameplay, you need to disable the Easy Swing feature in your character settings. Basically, Easy Swing limits the mobility of Venom's swing. With Easy Swing disabled, you can manually control the position, angle, and motion of Venom's swing, which ultimately allows for higher mobility and a good way out of combat. Most of the time, you'll follow Venom's swing with Venom's next ability, Frenzied Arrival. It's a slam ability that allows you to come crashing down wherever you aim. The slam knocks up enemies caught in its radius, but it doesn't immobilize them. Before moving on, it's worth noting that enemies at the center of the slam will take more damage than enemies outside of its center. So whenever you're using this, just try your best to line up the center of the slam with your target. Following the slam, you can catch anyone caught in the slam's radius with Venom's next ability, Cellular Corrosion. A bunch of tentacles come shooting out of Venom and latch onto nearby enemies. Anyone caught in the tentacles will have reduced movement speed. But it's worth noting the tentacles will snap if affected targets leave Venom's range. However, if affected targets stay in Venom's range for about 3 seconds, the tentacles will deal a bit of damage before snapping. And now that you're in the middle of a fight, we move on to Venom's next and most important ability, which is Symbiotic Resilience. It's a shield ability that increases the shield strength based on how much HP Venom has during its activation. But to wrap up Venom's kit, we have his ultimate, Feast of the Abyss. Venom leaps up and then dives down into the ground, becoming a splotch of dark ink. Using the ultimate again will cause Venom to shoot up and maul the enemies like a shark, dealing damage equal to 50% of the enemy's max health. And it should be known that 100% of damage dealt with Venom's ult is converted into temporary shield to use right after. Moving on from Venom's kit, let's talk about matchups. I used Tier Maker to create a small and easy to consume tier list for everyone at home. Starting off with Free 99. These are characters that Venom can basically guarantee a KO on every time unless they're cracked at the game. And leading this tier, we have supports like Cloak and Dagger, Adam Warlock, Loki, and Luna Snow. There's no real damage from these characters, and they're practically sitting ducks, and there's not much more to be said about it. Finishing off this tier, we have Black Widow. She's a sniper that has to aim down sight for any significant damage, so she can't really do anything against 19 inches of Venom in her face. Good luck, Black Widow. Moving on to the easygoing tier, these are characters that won't really punish you for diving them, but also won't reward you. Leading this tier, we have supports like Jeff and Rocket Raccoon. These two can be hard to kill because of their size, especially Jeff, who can easily become a really small target when he dives into walls and floors. But generally, both are pretty harmless to Venom. And finishing off this tier, we have Doctor Strange. Venom can easily dive behind Strange's shield to attack the rest of the team. Also, Strange is usually a frontliner, meaning that if he puts down his shield to help his team with Venom, he usually leaves his back exposed to Venom's team. So in the end, either Strange takes a lot of damage or his team does. But either way, against Venom, he's a pretty easy matchup. And moving on to the next tier, we have the 50-50 tier. As the name suggests, characters in the 50-50 tier are usually a gamble. Dives against them can either go well or bad depending on the player. Honestly, I wouldn't overthink diving characters in this tier, but just keep in mind that these aren't optimal targets compared to characters covered in the first 2 tiers. Starting off this tier, we have several damage characters that I won't bother naming. All these characters present their own unique challenges to Venom, whether be it their mobility or ranged weapons, but whenever you face one of them, just make sure to assess the situation and adapt your strategy as need be. Next in the tier, we have a few tanks without particularly strong counters to Venom's kit. Again, just take some time to assess the situation whenever you see these guys, and you'll be fine. But finishing off this tier, we have Mantis. I feel like Mantis is hard to kill than a support like Luna Snow because of her CC, Spore Slumber. I don't know if it's just me, but I swear Spore Slumber just lasts longer than Luna Snow CC. But anyways, without the CC, Mantis is a pretty standard support target for Venom, meaning you can easily dive her if you know her CC is on cooldown. And now onto our second to last tier, we have the Proceed with Caution tier. The title is pretty self-explanatory, and as you might have figured, characters below the 50-50 tier are generally going to be worse matchups for Venom. Starting us off again, we have Iron Fist. Iron Fist can be notoriously hard to kill because of his bonus shields he receives from his block ability Dragon's Defense, and his Chi Absorption passive which grants him shield upon receiving an assist on a KO'd enemy. At best, he'll waste your time, but at worst, he'll beat your ass. Next on this tier, we have characters with flight, like Star-Lord, Iron Man, and Storm. Their flight abilities easily give them the advantage over Venom, who doesn't have much damage off of the ground. Not to mention, all three of them can easily deal range damage while kiting Venom with their flight. I probably don't have to explain how frustrating it is to fight against someone who's flying. After that, we have anti-dive characters like Moon Knight, Namor, and Scarlet Witch. These three don't need to aim because of their abilities, and this makes them pretty difficult to KO because Venom's mobility is what often gives him an advantage in battle. Moon Knight and Namor especially can easily damage anyone trying to dive them with a good Ankh or Squid turret setup, but if you're really interested in diving them, just make sure to deal with their abilities first and you should be fine. Next up, we have Hawkeye and Punisher, which are two insanely high damage characters that can just delete Venom in a few seconds. Hawkeye's charge shot is literally enough to one-shot damage characters, and it can just shred Venom if he doesn't have a shield available to him. Meanwhile, the Punisher's shotgun can easily melt Venom's HP, so generally it's best to avoid diving him unless you notice the player you're up against has problems switching their guns on the fly. And finishing off this tier, we have Brawl stars like Thor and Magneto. Both are tanks easily capable of doing a good amount of damage while still tanking, but especially Magneto. And while they aren't life-threatening, especially compared to others in this tier, I would still proceed with caution when picking a fight with either of these two. And finally, moving on to our last tier, we have the Avoid at All Costs tier. With a name for a tier like that, you can assume that all these characters are ones you want to avoid as Venom unless the player is literal dog shit at the game. Starting us off again, we have Penny Parker, who is the exact opposite of Venom. Her abilities counter Venom's kit to a T, with bullshit like her spider nest and arachnomines that create minefields worse than a World War II battlefield. If Penny's camping a small space with her spider nest out of sight, good luck going in or coming out alive. Venom's bread and butter is swinging and just diving the enemy backline. Meanwhile, Penny's bread and butter is huddling up close to the team and using traps to annihilate dive characters like Venom, so you can see now why the matchup is really bad. Not to mention, she also has a CC ability that can lock Venom in place while her entire team just molest him. But moving on, next up we have Groot. He's not as bad as Penny, but generally speaking he presents a similar problem to Venom players. His wall abilities can block off the rest of your team, which will cut off your healing supply. Or even worse, they can block off your escape entirely. If Venom can't leave a dive gone wrong because of Groot's walls, then chances are he'll be KO'd. Not to mention, Groot's CC ultimate can put you in a tough spot if your healers are distracted or KO'd, and your shield is on cooldown. Next up, we have Wolverine. Unlike other characters, all of Wolverine's attacks do max HP % damage rather than flat damage numbers, meaning that Wolverine's especially good against characters with big HP pools like Venom. On top of that, he has 2 CCs in his kit that can easily put you in a shitty spot if aimed correctly. And of course, both CCs also set him up to melt your health again. And finally, last but not least, we have Squirrel Girl. When it comes to CCs, she's pretty much the best in the game hands down. Her CCs come out fast and have a decent range to it. Also, her CC can bounce off walls and easily hit Venom at random even if she misses. Not to mention, she can CC you twice in a row, which is pretty much more than enough time for her and her team to shred you down if you don't have access to Venom's shield. Now let's move on to maps. In game, Venom needs a lot of vertical and horizontal space in order to use Venom Swing properly. So usually the following maps will be good for Venom. Yggdrasil Path, which is a cart push map. Yggdrasil Royal Palace, which is a capture point map. Tokyo 2099 Shin Shibuya, which is a cart push map. Tokyo 2099 Spider Islands, which is a cart push map. Wakanda Hall of Jijala, which is a cart push map. And Clintar, which is another cart push map. On the other hand, maps with small restricted spaces will usually leave Venom unable to swing around freely, and and even though he can still use his wall run ability, these maps are really awkward for him in general, so proceed with caution. And finally, moving on to the last section of the video, I'll be doing breakdowns and corrections of common mistakes I see new Venom players making. Starting with mistake number 1, which is not taking a good position before team fights. Venom's thick as fuck, but despite his massive size, it's actually pretty easy to hide from the enemy before a team fight. If your attempt at hiding was successful, congratulations. You can watch the enemy without them knowing, and you should have a free lineup on a backline dive once you've decided on a target. If you see a healer sitting far back from their team, you can steal the first KO of the game without a sweat. But generally speaking, don't wait too long before your dives, otherwise your team is down a member for no reason. Time spent away from your team should be time spent dismantling the enemy backline. But wait a second, before that dive, we still need to go over another mistake I usually see that sometimes costs Venoms their life. Mistake number 2, always using Venom Swing before a fight without a good reason. Now I'm not saying you can't use Swing to dive the enemy. Swing is an essential part of Venom's kit and easily positions you deep in the enemy backline. But when you can still reach the enemy backline without using Swing, the Swing becomes unnecessary. Good dives can usually be set up using Venom's wall run, since Venom can climb up to a high enough point to dive from. So if you're close enough to the enemy's backline, try using Venom's climb to set up your dive instead of his swing. But you're probably asking, why is it so bad to use the swing before combat? Well, team fights can be crazy and sometimes you need a quick escape from a bad dive. For example, if you dive and your team doesn't engage, this usually leaves you without healing or damage. And if your team isn't engaging, the fight can easily become a 1v4 or 1v6 with Venom solo against the enemy team. So in this situation, you want to have Venom Swing available to you. Swinging into a dive puts you at an 8-second cooldown, and believe it or not, 8 seconds is more than enough time for the enemy to KO you if they're skilled enough. But moving on, let's say you get a good position and a backline dive. You aim straight for your target and you're in a 1v2 or maybe even a 1v4. You're probably asking, now what? Well, this takes us to the next 2 mistakes. Mistake number 3, using Venom's shield too early. Mistake number 4, not knowing when or how to leave a dive. So like I said before, the strength of Venom's shield is based on how much HP he has during its activation. And even though the shield should only be used at low health, the problem is that some of us panic the second our health drops below 50%. Ideally, you want to use the shield when Venom's health falls around 20%, but don't fall into the trap of waiting it to be 10% or lower before you use the shield. Generally speaking, in a hectic team fight, if you fall below 20% health, you can be KO'd in a second. So even though you might get more shield from having only 10% health, the risk is usually not worth it. But moving on, if we're talking about escape, first off, never leave yourself in a tight space, especially if you're diving without a healer to pocket you. Even though Venom is super tanky, he's easy to hit because of his size, and just isn't meant for low mobility combat. So fighting in a small or tight space puts you at a disadvantage, and worst case scenario might even lead to an easy KO for the enemy team. If you're in need of an escape, be mindful of good places to latch your swing onto, and know the fastest route back to either your team or a heal pack on the map. Attempting to leave combat is useless if you just entrench yourself further behind the enemy lines, because your team won't be able to help you, and you won't be able to help them either. So again, just make sure you're returning to your team whenever need be, and feel free to use Venom Slam to position yourself right in front of a healer if need be as well. And finally, before I close out this video, there's one last important mistake I see not just Venom players making, but lots of new players in general. Mistake number 5, refusing to swap off Venom or not knowing when to. Again, if you're playing Venom for fun, then by all means play however you want. But if you're trying to get better, then you have to acknowledge situations where Venom is just not viable to play, or worse, detrimental to you and your team. Like I said previously, consider Venom's matchups when choosing him mid-game. If you see the enemy team is full of hard CC and burst damage, then what's the point of even playing Venom against them? Also, consider your team's own lineup and objective. If your team is supposed to defend a point, and you have stationary characters like Penny and Groot who are the literal opposite of Venom, then how are you supposed to support them? Unless you intend on throwing the game, you should always consider the pros and cons to using your character of choice. But if you're like me and you're just excited to see the nude Venom mod in-game, then just play him.